All right, so my job today, Wyatt and my job here today is to talk about fish and wildlife resources that are present here in Clark County. And a little bit about myself. I am a biologist for USDA, which for most people is kind of like those people that run the Forest Service or inspect your meat. USDA has many, many arms and agencies, different branches. But my agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, is one of the lesser known agencies within USDA. And I have been with the agency almost 30 years. I graduated from Oregon State University with 2 bachelor's degrees, one in fisheries and one in wildlife. I joined up with this agency as a student trainee, and I have never looked back. And throughout the presentation, I think you'll understand a little bit of why I love my job. But before we launch into that, I just wanted to give my coworker Wyatt a chance to introduce himself.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. Like Rachel said, my name is Wyatt Wood. I'm with Pheasants Forever, which is a nonprofit organization. We're nationwide grassroots organization that's very much focused on the conservation of wildlife habitat. As you can see in the bottom right corner of the Pheasants Forever logo, it's the habitat organization. And I work very closely with NRCS to deliver a lot of their programs for conserving fish and wildlife habitat on private lands.
Fantastic. You're going to hear a little bit more from Wyatt later on as he showcases one of our special species here in Clark County. So a little bit about the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS for short. The government, we love our acronyms. Our agency got started back in the Dust Bowl, and this picture on the screen is kind of typifies what happened in the 1930s when we had a very, very serious string of drought years in the central part of the United States, where we had converted a lot of what was grass prairie to cropland. And unfortunately, we had a lot of wind-blown soil erosion that unfortunately displaced hundreds of thousands of people across the nation, and they had to abandon farmlands. And one of the things that happened, and this is a true story, is that when Congress was in session in the early 1930s, one of those big dust storms that was full of soil from the Midwest actually darkened the sky in Washington, D.C. And that was when Hugh Hammond Bennett stood up and made the case to start what was called the Soil Erosion Service. And from that point on, my agency has been working with private farmers and ranchers, and we've expanded to forest landowners and aquaculture as the years have gone by. That's kind of the genesis of the Soil Erosion Service that became the Soil Conservation Service. We became known as the leaders in soil mapping across the United States, and we've really diversified the types of assistance that we provide. We treat natural resource concerns on a voluntary basis. We are not a regulatory agency, which is one of the great things about working here. Our customer base is really very diverse. Like I said, we work with private landowners that own all types of working agricultural operations. We assist tribal governments. We work with other federal agencies and local and state governments, such the local organizations, such as Clark Conservation District. We work with a variety of size of private lands, from backyard, urban community gardens, and individual gardens to out to rural properties, and also with nonprofit organizations. So the suite of our customer base has really expanded over the years. And in short, our agency is here to help people help the land. And we really do that on a voluntary basis by providing technical assistance, and then those landowners can decide if they want to apply then for financial assistance through the Farm Bill. And that's how we put some money into the hands of our hardworking producers across the United States. So zeroing into my focus area and Wyatt's focus area, our job here today is to really talk to you guys about common wildlife species here in Clark County. We're going to talk about some things that you can do to enhance habitat on a small and large scale here in the county. We're going to talk a wee bit about pollinators because I really feel like that actually deserves a whole separate webinar. And then Wyatt's going to give us some notes on one special species of note. Since we cannot be in the field today, I just wanted to give you guys a really brief introduction to some migratory wildlife here in Clark County. And we're going to do that by looking at a very short 3-minute OPB video. Wyatt, are you seeing the slides on your end on the presentation? Before I switch to this, I just wanted to check.
Right now I'm seeing the video, but I have been seeing the slides as well.
All right, thank you so much. I need to check every once in a while. All right, here we go. Just take a minute and enjoy.
This weird new tool is quickly becoming the most popular Christmas gift of 2022. It combines all the power of a traditional chainsaw.
I was trying to avoid the commercials and they got in there anyway. All right, everybody, I just really wanted to queue up our amazing wildlife resource that we have, and that was taken at the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge. And if you have not been at least on the drive at Ridgefield Wildlife Refuge, I really strongly encourage you to do it in the next few weeks, because we have had so much rain this spring. Some of our waterfowl populations are still hanging out, and there always is a resident population there. But that video really focused in on our migratory tundra swan population that we get that migrates south from the Arctic. into the Puget Sound and the Willamette Valley during the winter. You saw an endangered deer species, which you'll hear about from Wyatt later. You saw our Canada goose migratory populations there, and a whole variety of other wildlife. I will say that the mammal that you saw there, that is a nutria, which is a non-native species, but they are pretty cool to watch anyway. So I just wanted to give you just a moment of actual wildlife before we dive into the one-dimensional photo wildlife here. So as you guys all probably know, the number one problem that wildlife in Clark County and across the world face today is just loss of habitat, and that's because of human activity. Even here in Clark County, we continue to see development and expansion of the human footprint into our wild areas, which is one of the reasons that I'm so thrilled that our city and county have such a robust parks and recreation and naturescaping and urban forestry department. I'm very proud of our county for investing in those resources. Climate change and new diseases coming in are other factors that are really threatening and causing decline in our wildlife populations. But this is kind of like the public service announcement here, but we can all help. We can all combat the loss of habitat. And the amazing thing is, it doesn't matter what the size is. The size of wildlife habitat can literally be a flower pot on your front porch or back porch, where you provide some pollinator resources or a nectar source for hummingbirds. So let's go ahead and launch that poll, Grace. And I just want to get a little feedback from you all on what type of wildlife have you seen in your own backyards? So I believe this is a multiple choice question here, and I'll just give you a few minutes to pick some of your favorite or the things that you have seen. We'll talk a little bit about it. In my own backyard, I just have a city lot outside in Salmon Creek, a tiny backyard. I have a water feature, and I'm that neighbor that has the messy lawn full of clover and trefoil and all kinds of beautiful plants, in my opinion, but it doesn't follow the model of the perfect urban lawn. So in my yard, I see a lot of different pollinator species. I have rough-skinned newt in that commonly come into the garage every year. I have a variety of garter snake subspecies. We used to have coyotes in my neighborhood, and of course, I've got a lot of songbirds in my yard. How are we doing, Grace?
It looks like we are currently at 12 out of 16 participants. So, 13 out of 16. So we're getting those last few people.
Excellent. How about you, Grace? What do you see in your yard?
Let's see. So I live in an apartment complex, which means that I don't have a crazy big yard, but I do have a balcony that is covered with a whole bunch of pollinator plants. So I see lots of butterflies. And we actually have a beehive at my apartment complex that's like shared between all of the folks that are here. So lots of bees.
I'm sure people are thrilled about that. Yeah, it's an educational opportunity every time I'm in my front yard, because people know that I am the bee and the bird lady. So why don't you go ahead and share, Grace, the results here with everybody. Ah, the raccoons. Yes, I have a backyard hen house, and after a couple of losses of hens due to raccoons, we had to install an automatic chicken door. That really is a thing. Shrews, those small mammals, mice, bats. I have bats that visit my backyard every spring and summer, and I cannot wait for those warm evenings to sit outside and watch them dip down. And they swing around kind of an open field behind my house and are eating insects on the wing over my water feature. So it's really exciting. I love to bring non-wildlife enthusiasts to my backyard to sit still and watch bats. Many people have a fear of bats, and I find the best way to break them of that is to get them right out in it to see that the bats are not interested in us. They are very interested in just their next meal. Everybody that responded has seen pollinators in their yard. About half of us have seen some amphibians, some reptiles, another 50%, small mammals, squirrels and chipmunks. Most of the squirrel, all of probably the majority of the squirrels that folks have seen here in Clark County are the non-native eastern gray squirrels, but they still are very fun. We have a healthy population outside my office here in East Vancouver. 50% of you have seen some of our native ungulates with deer and elk. That's pretty exciting. That tells me we've got some folks that live in the suburban or rural areas of the county. And then 93% of you have seen birds and skunk, porcupine, about half. So I think that's amazing. And I love just that little exercise to stop and look at that diversity, even though we live in a very developed portion of the county. You know, I think that it just goes to show that no matter the scale, you can enjoy wildlife. That one species that almost everyone has reported are birds. Here in Clark County, you just saw a subset of our migratory waterfowl. And when we look, I think our urban forester talked a minute ago about the importance of looking at a regional scale. Clark County sits right in the middle of the Pacific Flyway on the west coast of North America. And the birds are flying back and forth between their breeding grounds up in the Arctic to their wintering grounds on the wetlands in the valleys of the Pacific coast. So Clark County, being sort of at the northern tip of the Willamette Valley, hosts a wide variety of overwintering species. Birding is one of the best ways, I think, to introduce non-nature people to the outside world. It's exciting. Our birds are colorful, especially this time of year. Everyone's in their breeding colors because everyone's looking for a date. It's time to settle down and build our nests and raise our young. And so the males of the species most of the time are in their bright breeding colors. And birds are fairly simple to identify. So the songbirds, the waterfowl, I'm not very good at waterfowl, but the songbirds are kind of fun to watch. And there is a whole variety of nonprofit organizations that are very interested in engaging us in citizen science. The Great Backyard Bird Count actually already happened for this year, but it's scheduled for 2024 already. And you can actually click on the website that's on here and go to see the results by region of what we found in the citizen science backyard birding. So launching into general habitat requirements for fish and wildlife, you know, as much as I like to think that my scientific discipline is super complicated, at the end of the day, we're not talking about rocket science here. It comes down to really three basic things: something to eat, something to drink, and someplace to hang out. Food is a variety, you know, our habitat requires, our wildlife require a variety of plant species and habitat types. And we're going to look at a few of those in a minute. Water sources, natural or artificial. We actually are in a really diverse wildlife landscape here because we have an abundance of surface water here in Western Washington. Between our wetlands, our streams, our seeps and springs, we have a lot of natural water sources, which makes this a hot spot for wildlife. And then cover. You know, these animals need a place to escape from predators. They need places to rest when it's hot outside. They need a place to reproduce and just rest and hang out. We have a fancy term for that called just loafing or basking habitat if you're a turtle. Going into our forest land wildlife category, you know, I'm a real proponent of talking about our common species. A lot of times biologists will only give presentation on species that are threatened or endangered, which, don't get me wrong, is very critical, but you know, to most of you out there, you're never going to see many of those listed species. But what you are going to see or hear is a grouse walking and hiking here in Western Washington. That little yellow circle there, that's my attempt at showing a grouse. And I think it's a ruffed grouse, but I'm not positive. It could be ruffed or blue. I'm a terrible photographer, I already warned you. You know, we have a variety of owl species. Just last week, I saw a barred owl when I was out doing a wetland monitoring. We have a barn owl that uses my neighborhood, and we actually have great horned owls here in Clark County as well. A variety of small mammals, shrews, different mice and vole species. Voles are just basically a large field mouse. Variety of salamander species, chipmunks, black bear, black-tailed deer, porcupine, and bats utilize our forest ecosystems. So what I do when I work with people that own forest land, really of any size, I've worked on projects that are just an acre here in Clark County, all the way up to a couple hundred acres when I move out towards the coast. One of the first things that we evaluate is how many vertical layers of habitat do we see in these forests? And a lot of our forests here in Western Washington and across the state are working forests, meaning that those landowners are prioritizing the growth of the forest for future harvest, for future logging. One of the really cool things about my job is that in almost every case, there's a place in that forest stand that is really not suitable for providing or for growing really great straight timber. Those are the opportunities for Wyatt and I to pounce and say, okay, well, in this area, can we diversify those vertical layers? And you'll see that photo on the very left. You'll see the tallest trees are a deciduous canopy of, I believe those are actually alder trees there. And then as you move down towards the ground, let's see, I wonder if my pointer works in this. Let's take a look. So as we move down into this layer here, you get into a shrub layer. This is an oak, the center photo is an oak maple mixed woodland here, where we've got an oak here, a maple tree here, and we've got a variety of shrubs. And then down on the forest floor, you start to see an herbaceous layer, which is just a fancy name for grasses and wildflowers. This picture on the right is very typical of what we see in a stand that is being managed primarily for timber harvest. One of the things that we do is we thin that out to improve the growth rate for the trees that are left standing. And you can see these little fledgling green guys down on the bottom, opening this canopy up so that the sunlight reaches those plants. The really great thing is they respond on their own, and they will grow and create that next vertical layer. Along the way, we like to encourage woody habitat in the form of standing snags or dead trees or dying trees that are used by a host of species. Kind of the main one that comes to mind when we see a snag are woodpeckers, that are the source of, we call them primary cavity excavators. And they are out there looking for food, and they also excavate nests for themselves. Well, those nests are utilized by bats and small mammals and other forest birds for their own nesting sites, becoming secondary cavity nesters. So we look to create snags in a variety of ways. If you've got someone with experience climbing trees, this takes a professional tree climber. You can take the top out of trees, but the most common things that we do are we girdle the bottoms of trees to kill the tree and basically stop it from transporting nutrients up and down the stem, which will eventually kill it. Downed logs in the forest floor are really essential. They're like little mini sponges out there, especially in the heat of the summer. They have soaked up all of this lovely rain that we're getting now, and they're homes to salamanders. This is a western redback salamander. Again, my terrible photography skills. But you can see that's a place that those guys will hang out. A lot of times we're working in stands with really small diameter trees, and someone might say, well, gosh, I don't have any trees that are that big to cut down. And when I say big, I'm looking for a tree that's more than 20 inches in diameter to drop onto the ground. So what do? Well, we utilize the materials that we have available. And in this picture, it's an example of what I call a linear log pile that kind of simulates one of those larger downed logs. It has these little spaces in between it for those salamanders and other wildlife to hang out. And it's got good contact with the ground, which is an excellent place to escape predation. In the background of that picture, you see a habitat pile or a brush pile. Brush piles are one of the easiest things that we can do in the forest. On the right, you'll see kind of a line drawing of it. Super simple concept. Take the biggest pieces of whatever you got out there. You can layer things that fall out of trees during winter storms and layer them on an existing log or stump. If you've got some pieces of broken up concrete, you can use that to build the base out in your forest. And then you just keep piling on progressively smaller diameter material on the top of it. And what that does is it creates escape cover for many species of wildlife. And in some cases, such as this one in the lower right photo, we had a black bear move in, which was exciting for the landowner, but not all landowners are super excited to have bears. It takes a special person to allow those in. And then the other thing that we do a lot in our jobs in conifer woodlands is we create forest openings to let mast producing shrubs, and mast is a fancy biology term for soft fruit and hard nuts. So we need openings for these native shrubs to actually flower. And when you get flowers, you get fruit, and fruit is habitat, or excuse me, forage for a variety of species. I wanted to highlight a rare ecosystem, a different type of woodland that we have here in Clark County. We have oak woodland. Many of you have probably been down to Fort Vancouver area and the Vancouver lowlands down by Vancouver Lake. There's some very beautiful, big, open-grown Oregon white oak. Those areas were prairie habitat, grasslands that had wide, big, open-grown oaks in them that were spaced out, kind of like you think of a nature show you saw as a kid, where you saw, you know, the giraffe on the Serengeti. Those trees were widely spaced. That's what our prairie ecosystem looked like here in Clark County. But as you move into higher elevations in the foothills and out into the Columbia Gorge, out towards Camas, Washougal, we start to get into oak woodland. And oak woodlands are a mixture of those same Oregon white oak and other species, primarily ash, alder, maple, and a few cedar. And those are one of the most endangered ecosystems we've got here in Clark County. They have a huge diversity of understory plants. You've got sessile trillium here. You've got early violet and larkspur. Why are oaks so special? Why does Rachel get so excited about oak? Well, the reason is because it's one of our few nut producing species. We really only have two native nut producers. We've got the oak and we've got our hazelnut, or beaked hazelnut, or some call it California hazelnut. Those are the only two native nut producers that we've got. Of course, we have a variety of things that we have brought in because we think they're delicious, like the walnut, the black walnut. But our native oaks are associated with part of the life diet and the life history of over 200 species, and that is just massive. Western gray squirrel is a oak associate, and unfortunately they've been extirpated or they're no longer here in Clark County, but they used to be here, and it's a threatened species in the state of Washington. The bottom photo there on the right is a western pond turtle, and I know that it sounds strange because I'm talking about a turtle and oak, but the western pond turtle breeds in open grassland associated with seasonal or perennial wetlands. Often they were found on the floodplain of the Columbia River, and there was a lot of oak habitat in that next elevational layer next to the water. And oak trees drop very thick leaves, and those leaves are places where turtles will come out of the water and bury themselves down and what's called estivate. They don't exactly hibernate like bears do, so oaks are actually utilized by even western pond turtles. And our habitat risk factors are very similar across all of the habitats that we're going to talk about today. Understory competition by non-native species. That photo on the left is a non-native blackberry, and I'm sure everyone has been into blackberry from time to time. They are delicious, I will say that, they are tasty, but they are incredibly competitive and outcompete all of the natural native understory plants. And if that wasn't enough, oak habitats are at attack from the top down as well. Conifer encroachment, so primarily Douglas fir, will outgrow an oak tree 2 to 1. Oak habitats grew up in a very fire dependent landscape. I know that's like kind of mind blowing when we look out the door here in Clark County now and we see this sea of development and people. But this area, our prairie habitats here in Clark County, used to receive very regular burning by the Native American populations here. And the tribes used to burn these areas to attract big game to the regrowth, the green regrowth that comes in post-fire. And they also, those fires also burned the young conifer trees. So without fire, the Douglas fir conifer seed blows in and starts to grow in these forests. And without them, again, they will grow faster than our oak, and the oak will eventually die. And lastly, land conversion is the last threat to our oak woodlands. So I'm going to pause for a second. Grace, is there any questions that you want me to answer out loud now, or should I just keep moving?
Yeah, our chat has a couple of questions in it. There's a couple that I think are meant for Jade and Dorian from, so I'm gonna leave those ones there for them. One question was, so with the linear log piles, the question was, if you do that, isn't that dangerous for like wildfire purposes, in terms of like ladder fuel? What's the connection there?
Oh, really great question. Great question. You know, when I first started my career, I never really considered the threat of landscape level fire here in Western Washington. That was just not really something that we heard of a lot. For those of you that know Clark County history, Eastern Clark County was part of the Yakult burn, which was a massive landscape fire that happened, I believe, in like 1902, somewhere in that realm, and burnt a third of Eastern Clark County into Skamania County. It moved quickly. And also the Tillamook burn down in Oregon, those really, really big fires. But those fires were kind of the exception. We didn't have these large stand replacing fires that happened all that often. However, as we know, our climate is getting drier and our summers are hotter and longer. And so leaving wood accumulations in the forest fire is definitely a consideration. So when we plan these things, these habitat structures to leave, we make sure that they are well away from roads, because roads are one of the places that fires start. We try to do it well away from trails. And also we take into consideration that these larger logs and this accumulation of log piles are typically placed in places where we've already thinned the forest and we removed that excess of ladder fuels. So in essence, we try to place them in clearings and other places like that that are away from the crop tree. Those considerations become even more important as we take that concept east of the Cascades into our dry ponderosa pine forests. Over there, fire concern is very, very high. And a lot of the slash that we take down when we do those forest thinning projects actually gets hauled off the site and is used for biofuel, or they will chop it up and use it as mulch. So here in Western Washington, a lot of the times we pile and leave that debris from the thinning, but those bigger pieces is definitely, the larger the log you put on the ground, the more water it soaks up, and it itself is typically not the ignition source. So I hope that answered that person's question.
Yeah, wonderful. The next question was, I think maybe one slide back, there was an oak picture. I just wanted to know, are those nuts or were those apple galls or what were those?
Ah, excellent, excellent. Yes, so those are galls, yes. And these galls, this is a variety of different gall species, which is an insect. It's a wasp. Galls are a wasp species that will actually lay their egg on the surface of the oak leaf, and it grows this protective covering around it. So it appears, you know, that it would be destructive to the tree. But these gall wasps are actually native species, and they're an associate of oak ecosystems. We see sometimes when oaks have been in a prolonged drought where they're more susceptible to damage by oak gall wasps and other diseases. There's an oak looper, which is a caterpillar. Gypsy moth is a non-native species that will come into oaks. Mistletoe actually is a native species, but it also, when the oak is weakened, all of those things can start to kill off the crown, which is the live part of the canopy. But the amazing thing is, oaks are one of our most adaptable, strongest surviving species. Rarely do they kill it. The taproot of an oak is 2 to 4 times deeper than the top growth. Think about that for a second. How deep these taproots go down with oaks. And because they have so much of their energy stored underground, subsurface, usually they can survive these insect quote attacks. But excellent. I call them poppers. As a kid, we used to go out and step on them. It was like super fun, but excellent questions.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to pasture wildlife, and we can come back for more questions at the end. I want to make sure we have time to get through all of the information. So moving on to our next kind of habitat focus area is pastureland wildlife. And common species that we see with these open grassland areas are voles, like I mentioned before, which are just a big field mouse. Northern harrier, which is also known as a marsh hawk, is a raptor species that will commonly hunt over these open grasslands. We have 4 subspecies of garter snake here. Elk, we do have a healthy population of elk here in Clark County, especially as you go east. I haven't seen elk in the city. Geese, which amazingly enough are grazers. They eat grass just like cows. Tree frogs are common associates with grass open areas. Red-tailed hawk is another one of our very, very common raptor species. We actually have one of the highest concentrations during the winter of red-tailed hawks in the United States, where red-tailed hawks migrate south as well. And start paying attention around Thanksgiving to the freeway signs. As you're driving up and down the freeway, you'll start to see a hawk perched on each one of them. They space themselves about a half a mile apart, and they set up mini home ranges here in the northern part of the Willamette Valley and then down through the Willamette Valley. And then, of course, a variety of pollinator species that utilize the flowering resources of these open grasslands. You can think of grasslands, especially our areas that are utilized by livestock, as replacement prairie habitat. Again, Clark County kind of sits like the hat on the top of the Willamette Valley. And the Willamette Valley was very much a grass prairie dominated landscape prior to European settlement. It was incredibly productive soils in the Willamette Valley. And so when we got here, we decided that we were going to convert a lot of that ground to crop ground. And those are the places where we enjoy our amazing red wines in the Willamette Valley today. The Willamette Valley grows the most grass seed in the world. So we've converted the native grasses into turf grass development and other seed crops. So Clark County is on the top end of that. And the really great thing about livestock agriculture and pasture is that we can manage these systems to simulate fire. Livestock are excellent substitutes for fire when we can't burn. But when we do that, we want to avoid negative impacts to those native species that are out utilizing those habitats. So we avoid early season mowing, we avoid early season hagging here, and we try to encourage our landowners to wait until after July 1st if they're going to hay. We can maintain a 3 to 5 inch stubble height of our grass in our grazing units, which is really the best for keeping healthy grass and very tasty grass for for livestock. But at the same time, when you maintain that stubble height and you don't overgraze, kind of think of a golf green. We don't want that. We don't want that in our pastures. What that does is it allows for some flowers to come up which again will substitute for those native wildflowers in the prairie. So those flowers put on seed for birds and mammals, and then also are important pollinator resources. You know, even our weed species in pastures, our vetches, our clovers, those are incredibly important for wildlife. So like I said, in a working forest, it's fairly easy for me to convince a landowner to take a small amount of that area and set it aside and manage it just a little bit differently for wildlife, while at the same time allowing those people to still maintain those areas as a working farm. A few other common things that we work with folks on in a pasture situation is we'll install a raptor perch pole. That's the lower picture in the lower right. And why we do that is we like to get raptors right out in the middle of our woody plantings. Though I love wildlife of all kinds, some can be very destructive to our habitat development. And like the vole, the field voles, they love to strip the bark of young seedlings that we plant out along streams and for other habitat projects. And so when we bring a raptor perch pole in there, they're basically a little biocontrol for us to help our riparian or streamside plantings thrive. And also people love to see wildlife. And when you install these perch poles, raptors such as red-tailed hawk and the marsh hawk or the northern harrier, they'll readily use these. If you can get them, 20 feet tall is the target height. But you guys, I've seen red-tailed hawks on a 4-foot tall fence post. You know, they're really not that picky. That's a red-tailed hawk in the lower left there. Up in the upper right is an example where you've got the black-tailed deer, is an example of an unmowed leaf strip. So when I've got a landowner that's going to take a hay crop off, what we encourage them to do, and especially if they're going to take 2 hay crops off a year, is during that first haying, we encourage them to leave strips that are not mowed, so that you can leave some tall grass for our grassland nesting species. We do have a few species here that they nest on the ground. Savannah sparrow, rufous-sided towhee, mallards nest in tall grass. Of course, the signature pheasants forever species, our ringneck pheasants, will utilize grasses, a whole host of things. I will say the majority of our birds nest in shrubs and trees, but again, because this was historically partially prairie, we have ground nesting birds here. So we encourage landowners to leave some a little bit taller, leave some grass taller, and then they can come back after July, early to mid-July, and during their second cutting of hay, and then cut those species and bale them for hay as well. Escape ramps in livestock watering troughs are really, really critical. Even though we have an abundance of surface water here in the spring, as things dry out in the summertime, our wildlife species get thirsty, just like we do. And I see, unfortunately, a lot of floaters in watering tanks. So if you can take one thing away from my talk today, if you have friends that have livestock tanks on a farm, make sure that they install an escape ramp. And it's really important for that escape ramp to touch the sides of the tank. They're kind of a pyramid type shape here, or half part of a pyramid, because when something falls in, they can't climb out of the slick sides of the trough, and so they swim around and around and around until they drown. But if you attach something like this that's attached to the side, they can get it, and this is actually very fine mesh, and they can climb up and out. Lastly, rock piles in open pasture lands or on the edges of pasture land are really important for our native reptiles. We have a fairly low diversity of reptiles here in Clark County, but again, I mentioned our garter snakes. We have rubber boas, which is a super cool snake. And we've got northern alligator lizard. Those are probably our most common terrestrial reptile species. And this doesn't have to be fancy. Again, using broken up pieces of brick or other landscape rock to pile stuff on. You just want to make sure that these piles are located in an area that gets a lot of sun. Our reptiles are cold-blooded and they have to regulate their body temperature by basking in these areas. And so that's one of the things that we do in pastureland. So Grace, I'm going to pause here and we're going to switch speakers. But while I do, before we turn it over to Wyatt, is there any questions about pasture habitat in the Q&A?
Yeah, there's one question here that maybe relates to a few of the topics,
Okay.
but there was a question about what is the sort of the role or the place of native fruit trees in sort of managing flora and fauna. Where do those kind of fit in?
Okay, excellent. I love it. Native fruit trees. I mean, I'm a proponent of trying to get fruit trees. Again, I got to use the fancy word mast because, you know, that's how I earned my degree. I have to make it count, right? So soft mast is berry and fruit producing, and then that hard mast through our oaks and our hazelnut. So, I mean, I think they're very important, and a variety of species is better than just one species. Some that come to mind that are fairly simple to get started are salmonberry. If you're in a shady system, salmonberry are kind of like a native, let's see, raspberry, I guess you could say. They kind of have that growth and that's what they look like. They're actually fairly tasty if you get a chance to get the fruit off them. It's very rare because the wildlife can snatch them up before you can get them. So those are fairly easy to get going. Another shrub that's easy to establish here for the most part is some of our roses. Nootka rose, I think, is the most adaptable. And then you ask about trees. So Indian plum is an amazing tree that does get a little fruit on it. And later in the presentation, I think I have a picture of what those fruits look like. In our wetter places here in Clark County, we have a native black hawthorn that puts berries on. And then we have crabapple it's not an apple like you and I buy in the store, but it is in that same family. We've got some elderberries that are taller, especially blue elderberry. It can get very tall to a tree type height. But if you have an opportunity to put those native trees in, absolutely, you know, it's the first thing that it does is it provides a pollinator resource, you know, a source of nectar and pollen, especially early in the season while our crops are human and while our human yards are coming along. So a lot of our things that we put in our front yards, those non-native species are bred to bloom season long and later in the summer. So our native species are really excellent options to put in for that first part of the year. And I will say the one thing that I see is that folks will put in some of these native species. They'll put them in places that are a little too shady for them to actually flower and set fruit. So make sure that you're choosing a spot that gets enough sun for whatever species you're trying to get out there. Anything else, or should we move on to Wyatt?
There's one more that I think we can answer pretty quickly, which is one participant sees lots of kestrels on their rural road and want to know what type of trees do they typically nest in?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know what? Well, Wyatt's talking, I'm going to look it up because I have this amazing book here. I don't know is my answer, but I have this amazing book. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's called The Birders Handbook, and it's a field guide to the natural history of North American birds. And it goes by bird species and it talks about their nesting. So I'm going to get back to you on that. Don't let me forget. And I'll look that up while I turn it over to Wyatt.
Oh, hi again. I'm just going to go in a little more depth on a species that I find really interesting. Well, I guess a subspecies, and that would be the Columbian white-tailed deer. And it's actually the rarest subspecies of our white-tailed deer that you find in a lot of the United States. It's the westernmost subspecies. You don't find any other subspecies more west than these, and they're very much endemic to the Pacific Northwest. It's smaller than a lot of other subspecies of white-tailed deer found in more northern latitudes, so it's a little unusual for it to be as small. They prefer upland habitat. prairie edge forests and deciduous woodlands, like the oak woodlands that Rachel was talking about, are preferable habitat, but they've kind of been relegated to lowland and floodplain areas due a lot to habitat loss. And a lot of that is due to the human development of sort of the Willamette Valley area, plus the Puget Sound area has become very developed. And they also typically only have one fawn per season. It's very rare that you see that they have twins, but it has happened in the past, but not very often. So they have a somewhat slow population growth. You can go to the next slide. Historically, like I said, they were found as far north as in the Puget Sound area, up where I am. I work out of Olympia, and they are also found as far south as Grants Pass down in Oregon. But unfortunately now, at least as far as that we're aware, we can only find them in two places, and that is islands along the Columbia River and the surrounding areas, as well as there's a population in Douglas County, Oregon as well. Fortunately, they are protected because of two national wildlife refuges, Julia Butler Hansen National Wildlife Refuge, which was actually created specifically for the deer in order to protect them. And that's a little bit further northwest. And then the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, which we saw the video on earlier, and it's not very far away from the city of Vancouver at all. So if you haven't been out there yet, I highly recommend it. Beautiful area, and you can see these really rare deer out there. Next slide, please. A little bit background on their conservation status. It's somewhat unusual, at least in my mind, to have a talk about an endangered species, talk about a deer. You know, deer are usually very numerous. In fact, in a lot of cases, they're so numerous that we have to hunt them to sort of keep their numbers down. And one of the most commonly hunted species in the United States and the world are deer species. But unfortunately, this particular species has been threatened and endangered for quite a long time. In fact, it was listed under the Endangered Species Preservation Act, which is sort of the direct predecessor to the Endangered Species Act as we know it today. And I believe it was included in the first Endangered Species Act. So it's been listed for a very long time, since the 60s. They both, at the beginning, were listed as endangered. But fortunately, due to a lot of efforts that have been made, the Columbia River population has been reduced to threatened, and the Douglas County population down in Oregon has been delisted entirely because it's just recovered so well. And in 2005, Douglas County, or the state of Oregon, allowed the Douglas County population to be hunted for the first time in 40 years, to a lot of people's glee. And it's in no small part due to the conservation efforts of a lot of governmental entities, as well as private entities, and people really getting out there and conserving their habitat. Next slide, please. And some of those efforts look like translocation. The Ridgefield population up near Vancouver, they were translocated from Julia Butler Hansen National Wildlife Refuge. And initially they released about 58 animals, and now there's over 200 of them, and that's since 2014. So that translocation is very successful. The Ridgefield population is looking very healthy and looks like it's going to be there for a long time. And there's other sites that they're being translocated to. It's something that the State Department of Fish and Wildlife is doing a lot of work with. And this is mostly just to increase population numbers and the geographic range that they're occupying. It really is very helpful to do that, to protect the species as a whole, because any sort of huge catastrophe like a flood or a fire has a much less of a chance of actually eliminating a huge portion of the species when they're more spread out and there's more animals. And there's also a lot of habitat restoration work going on. That's a lot of what Rachel and I do, is trying to restore habitat on private and public lands. And it's both happening on their currently occupied lowland floodplain habitats, as well as their more preferred upland deciduous woodland habitat. So the future looks bright for this animal.
Great. All right, thank you, Wyatt. If you guys have any questions specifically about this species, let's hold them until the end. I'm realizing that I'm looking at my time, but I wanted to get back to you all. This is just a demonstration that even though I've been working as a fish and wildlife biologist for 30 years, I gotta look stuff up too. So here's what I learned about the American kestrel. Okay, so they prefer a nest tree. There are cavity nesters, so the participant who asked the question is spot on. They require a cavity, and remember, our cavities are coming primarily from dead or dying trees. Okay, so they need those snag habitats out in the woods, or just in well, they need those dying trees. They prefer to nest in a snag that's 12 to 80 feet tall, so that's quite a range. It doesn't specify specifically what type of tree they prefer, but I know that it says here often uses the same nest for second brood. The male feeds fledglings of the first brood and the incubating female. So these are some busy parents. They've got the teenagers in the hole, and she's raising their next generation of siblings at the same time. So that is a bird that is really maximizing energy into creating those next generations. It says here competes with other hole nesters for nest sites. Let's see. That's pretty much what I gathered here. So as far as what species, honestly, the tree that I see most often in Clark County providing cavity nests, large cavity nests, are big leaf maple. Big leaf maple are much more common across the county than our oak habitats. Our oak trees 100% would be utilized by a kestrel. But big leaf maple, even though it takes a lot to kill a maple tree. I have tried in places where I have too much maple, but they will drop. They have those large lateral branches, just like oaks. And when those drop off, the place where that branch attached to the main part of the tree is a spot where rot and other disease will enter the tree. And so those are the places where cavities start to form the fastest. So I would say big leaf maple, Oregon white oak, and then large conifers as well. And when I say large conifers, I'm talking about a Douglas fir with a diameter of 20 inches or greater. The bigger the diameter of the tree, the deeper that cavity can be excavated. And so the first rule of thumb is when we're out on any property, if we see snags or dying trees, we talk to the landowners about the importance of keeping those. Because a lot of people are like, oh, that tree is dying, let's cut it down and get it out of here. But just recognizing the incredible value they have for wildlife is part of what we do. So excellent question. Thank you for it. All right, so we're going to keep moving on here. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about riparian areas and stream wildlife that we have here. And again, I would say my time is probably 75% working in streams and wetlands in my job today. And so I could talk all day about the importance of our stream habitats and all of the amazing biodiversity that we've got. But here in Clark County, we have a variety of salmon species. The most common species that you will see in our streams is coho salmon, which are a federally listed species here in the Lower Columbia. And though everyone pictures a salmon looking like that picture in the lower left there, very few of us get to see that unless you're an actual fisherman, or if you happen to be hiking in a very stinky place where the fish have gone up, the adults have gone up the stream and died. Most of the time, we've got the juvenile salmon in our stream systems. And almost all the time, year round, there is some species of salmonid in our stream systems. Some species, such as our native cutthroat trout, are there and they spend their entire life in those freshwater systems. Our salmonid species will come and they will leave the saltwater oceans as adults, migrate up the freshwater systems to the same stream where they were born. okay, where they hatched out of their egg. It's just the most fascinating thing. If you think about the journey of an individual adult salmon that swims up to 1,000 miles from here in Washington State in the ocean, and they will find their way back to that exact stream where they hatched out. It's fascinating to me. It's a fascinating. But the thing to know is, even if you don't see these flashy, beautiful salmon, adult salmon, it doesn't mean that there aren't salmon in the stream. And I use the term salmonid to capture both our native trout and all of the species of salmon that we have. Mussels, okay, that picture in the middle, that's my hand, and that was taken last October in a stream that feeds into Lake Merwin Reservoir here in Clark County. That is a Western pearl shell mussel. That critter that I have in my hand is between 50 and 80 years old in my hand. It was absolutely one of the best days I've ever had as a fish biologist to be able to find that species so close to where I live. We were actually in the stream building a beaver dam analog, which if we have time, I'll show you some pictures of. We have mink, which is a real slinky mammal. They kind of slink along the ground here. We have river otter in Clark County. And the reason that they're here is because they're eating all of those salmon that we just talked about. Beaver, we have a reemergence of beaver coming back into our county, which you guys, if you really stop, and I kind of geek out about this stuff, I'm not gonna lie. If you really think about Clark County and our association with Fort Vancouver and the Hudson Bay fur trapping post, this was the epicenter of beaver decimation of the West. This spot here in Clark County, and to see that beaver are coming back into our stream systems, to me is just an amazing, it's an amazing example of how resilient Mother Nature can be. Beaver, of course, come with their own set of challenges. When we have beaver in creating dams and causing flooding in places where humans are living and we are trying to drive our cars, and we have farmers trying to farm. But we are working together with working landowners to try to find a way that we can accommodate that beaver dam, manage the water level with some tricky engineering structures, to keep those beavers on the landscape. Stoneflies and mayflies on that list. That photo in the lower right-hand corner is an example of a caddisfly larva. And I used to call those periwinkles as a little kid, but there's these really cool aquatic insects and that utilize whatever substrates around them to make the cases. And so you'll see caddisflies that have these little pebbles like that are in this example. And I see places in streams that are in deep, dark forests where they use fir needles to make their cases around them, and they spin them with the same type of silk that silkworms use. And these caddisflies, along with the stoneflies and mayflies that you find in the stream, are actually the larval form or the juvenile, the baby form of a lot of the insects that fly around riparian areas. And if you're a fly fisherman, you know very well what those adults look like, because that's how you catch your trophy trout by fly fishing. So one of my favorite things to do is to go out with a net like you see in this photo. That's a D net. You can see the backwards D of the silver frame. Use my foot and I can kick up 4 to 12 species of aquatic insects just like that in a healthy stream. In a non-healthy stream, we'll have less species and we'll have different assemblage, but that's one of the most fun things to do. It's very rare that I won't find it. And then, like we talked about before, amphibians that require free water or open water to breed are also found in our streams. The upper right is a beaver lodge that you'll see from time to time. I love this picture of the stream on the right. I don't know where that was taken. That's not something that we're going to see right across the entire county, but as you go up the Washougal River and up the East Fork River, you start to get into what we call cascading reaches of streams and rivers. And there are places here where you can get out and enjoy views of streams in their more reference condition, basically kind of a more untouched condition that we see. But even streams that are down in the valley bottoms here that are very much integrated with our daily life. Salmon Creek comes to mind because that's where I live. It is full of fish and wildlife. And so making sure that we're trying to keep the streams shaded to reduce water temperature is very important. We try to keep, as Ashley said, texture in the streams by the form of logs that have fallen in, different sizes of rocks, and different vegetation that creates texture or places for fish to eat insects and to hide from predators. And connection to floodplains is very important. As we've seen, and as we've seen on the news in this year in California, places where we have moved, humans have moved into floodplains will re-wet in a flood. And that happens here in Clark County as well. We have a series of flood control reservoirs and dams. The biggest one, of course, is Bonneville, that regulates the flows that we would see here in Clark County. Without Bonneville, much of Vancouver would be under lower Vancouver, the lowlands, and even into downtown would be flooded on a fairly regular basis. So we're grateful to Bonneville for allowing us to live in such a beautiful place. Ashley with the Conservation District is a huge herpetologist, which is a fancy name for somebody that studies amphibians and reptiles. So she put this slide in. We do have all of these species on the screen here in Clark County, and they're not rare. We have a very high diversity of amphibians here because we are kind of at a crossroads between major regional habitat types. If you think about it, we have the floodplains of the Columbia River, which used to, before Bonneville, used to have a lot of water seasonally that flooded. But we also have those oak ecosystems, and we also have the variety of conifer-dominated forests as you go up in elevation. So it's a really special place, Clark County is. The Richfield area was prairie, just like the Willamette Valley. And so that's why we have that this great diversity of amphibians. Even in our most urbanized systems, that center picture on the left, I have one of those in my own neighborhood. And I will tell you what, in mid-February, it is a cacophony of chorus frogs. And I love to hear it. I love to try to sneak up on them because they hear you coming and it's like, oh, she's coming, and they stop. Like there's hundreds of frogs calling to each other. And then it's just silent the next minute. But these water retention ponds that are built in our developed areas will have a fairly healthy diversity of amphibians. The fancy term on here, hydro period, just talks about the length of time that you have water in these ponds. And depending on how much water will dictate which species will utilize those. Having a buffer area around those waterways where we're not dumping our yard debris and our used motor oil and all of that good stuff is really important. And like I said, like I showed you earlier, in a upland forest, those brush piles, you can even scale those down in your own little urban area to have some cover next to these urban ponds. So we were reminded that, even in the deep, dark city here, a city of concrete, there is wildlife here. We learned that we have pollinator resources on apartment patios here. We have, that's a peregrine falcon there on the I-5 bridge. Coyote, I know that we have had coyotes in my own neighborhoods, and that's another example of an old snag that someone has seen the value in or the beauty of and has kind of incorporated it into their landscape. And this upper picture here is a nesting structure for bees, which we'll talk about in a second. So the common practices for wildlife management in an urban environment are things that you've probably been told several times now in this course, but a quick reminder is that safe practices for urban wildlife, especially our amphibians, are limiting pesticide use and minimizing fertilizer use. Embrace your clover, embrace it. In the summertime, I don't have to water it. It's always green. Plant native plants where possible. And the benefits of native plants, as you guys have probably heard, are that they do, once they're established, they do require less water, and they're adapted to our climate, and they're adapted to surviving outbreaks of pests, pet waste, chemicals, anything we can to keep them out of storm drains that run into our surface waters. Please don't release your child's pets into the wild. I have a really great story. When I was young in my career up in Pierce County, I was working on a Saturday with a group of volunteers. We were doing a planting, and I got a call on the radio, and they're like, "You have to come up here. You have to see this turtle." And when I got up there, I was expecting to see, this little tiny turtle like the size of a hamburger bun. But someone had captured a snapping turtle. No joke. Its shell was like 2 feet across. I am not exaggerating. This thing took up a chunk of my Chevy S10 government pickup bed. And I was like, first of all, who picked it up, and do you have all of your fingers? Like, this thing had been living in this stream for probably 40 years. I couldn't even believe it. So anywho's, don't release non-native species into the wild. We've talked ad nauseum about vegetation and how important it is to maintain it. And that connections between upland and aquatic habitat, really important, if possible, even in a small micro scale, to look at, think like a wildlife species. If you're being chased by something and you're getting a drink, you want someplace close by to hide. And so keeping those connections between aquatic habitats and upland habitats is really important. Moving briefly into my wee bit of pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. When we talk about pollinators here in the Northwest, we don't just mean honeybees. European honeybees are a non-native bee, very important for crop pollination. But as you guys may have heard in the news, there's several things that are taking out our honeybees. And the costs of renting a honeybee hive for farmers has increased 6 to 8 times what it was 20 years ago. And believe it or not, they truck bees across the United States. They haul all of our bees to Central California and Florida during the winter. That's kind of our nation's salad bar growth area in the wintertime. And then they truck them back to pollinate the orchards of the West and the California coast. And so the price of renting hives is extreme. And so what that is that tells us that we have to invest in native pollinator habitat. Otherwise, we're going to be in big trouble because, drum roll, fun party facts here, 75% of all of our flowering plants are pollinated by pollinators. 35% of the world's crops, and 1 in every 3 bites of food we eat require a pollinator at some point in that plant's life cycle. So that to me tells us that it's kind of a call to action for us. We need to protect our native pollinators. Again, the principles of this are very similar to general wildlife management. Planting a variety of pollinator plants, natives if possible, but I'm telling you, it's difficult to find a native plant here in Clark County in Western Washington that blooms in September, because our native pollinators don't hibernate underground or in trees until it starts to freeze. And so we run out of things for them to eat in the native department late in the summer. So we look towards supplementing that with non-native species. In my own yard, I have a variety of woody herbs that bloom a second time. I've got some lavenders that will put on a second growth. It's not quite as beautiful as in spring. And I will let my oregano bloom, and that will bloom several times. I also plant sunflowers, and you can plant other annuals to kind of bridge that gap. Remember the clover in my yard? Also blooms all summer long. I don't mow very short, and I'll leave pollinator patches. It drives my husband crazy because I'm like, don't mow that spot. The bees need something to eat, especially when it's August and September and there's not a lot of other native things blooming. There's different things that you can do to create pollinator nesting habitat. The most common thing that we'll see are these bee blocks that are in the middle of the screen here. And most commonly, those attract the blue orchard mason bee. What we've learned though in the last 10 years is that these need to be cleaned out occasionally. And if you buy paper straws or create paper straws out of newspaper, you can just put those in these little holes. And then after the bees hatch out, well, it was started in March here, you can pull those straws and put new ones in for the next generation. But it's really important to clean those things out. The bee blocks, 4x4s that you drill with a drill are excellent, but again, you can't open them and clean them out. So it's really important that if you use a block of wood to drill into for mason bees, you've got to put those paper straws in. And we've got some other resources on the screen. You guys will all be getting this presentation in a PDF form, so you can click on those links and make them live. Aside from adding nesting habitat for bees and native pollinators, the importance of providing a season-long bloom is really important. And I've kind of alluded to the fact that it's hard to fill in that late season bloom here in Western Washington. Our natives are blooming right now, and they've been blooming for a month. The first things that come out here are the Indian plums, beautiful cascades of white flowers. And then the next thing that comes out is our native hazelnut has a teeny tiny flower on it. And then the next thing that blooms out is salmonberry, and it's starting right now. And it is beautiful. And you can start to hear the little VW bug hummingbirds when you walk through the woods and in our parks. They're here now. Red flowering currant is my favorite native plant. That's in the lower left screen there. And believe it or not, that willow, like you see in the upper left, is also a very early bloomer. They drop these little wormy looking things called catkins down, and those actually are tiny flowers that our bees and our butterflies will nectar off of. So we've got a whole variety of things that bloom March through early July here, and then it gets tricky to provide something to eat. The good news is that with our ornamental crops that our farmers are growing, they're filling in that crop period that set flowers in June, July. And then in August, September, we have a lot of ornamentals in our yards that fill in that bloom period. So just take a look, make a little log, make a little journal of what you see in your yard, in your neighbor's yard, and try to figure out if there's gaps in that bloom period. Now, how do you know what to plant? I know you can't read this slide. This is just an example of a table from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and they have some phenomenal pollinator resources, way better than anything that NRCS puts out, and we utilize their resources all the time. In fact, we work very closely one-on-one with a pollinator habitat specialist out of one of our offices in Oregon that comes along with us to help us plan specialty pollinator plantings. We've got some work going on the coast with a cranberry grower. Anyway, not to digress, but the Xerces has a pollinator resource center. When you click on that link, it'll take you to a map of the US. Click on the Pacific Northwest. And this is just a screenshot of a few of the publications that are available for free download. The pollinator plants, the Maritime Northwest region. I think that one of our first speakers was at Jade that alluded to this resource. This will tell you what grows here, and more importantly, it will tell you when it blooms. So it can help you, again, fill in those gaps in the bloom period. And it goes on and on. So I can get lost for hours and hours in the Xerces website, so enjoy that one. Other quick things around habitats around your home. We've talked ad nauseum already about the invasive plants and how they outcompete natives. We've already talked about the importance of planting fruiting shrubs. On the picture in the middle is red elderberry, and the picture on the right is Indian plum. So that's what the little fruits look like on an Indian plum. So it's not a plum like you and I think about. The wildlife sure do love them. Nesting boxes, we read in the Birder's Handbook that kestrels utilize nesting boxes. So that's a pretty cool way of trying to attract kestrels closer to your house so you can watch them. Remember, kestrels will attack other birds. So if you're a bird feeder, you're going to see some action if you bring a kestrel box into your yard. But my main thing about both nesting boxes for birds and bats and bumblebees is that it is imperative that they get cleaned out on an annual basis. If you don't do that, you're going to have yellow jackets move into them. They capture a lot of diseases, a lot of parasites and fungus because they don't breathe like a native cavity does. So please, if you decide to put up a nest box, you're committing to annual maintenance, and it's really important. I would much rather someone keep a standing snag or create a snag where it's safe than put up a nest box. But I do recognize that nesting boxes are really great ways to see wildlife closer to us, but please clean them out. So I'll get off my soapbox there. Bats will utilize nest boxes. I will tell you what though, in my whole 30-year career, I've only seen a couple of times when bats actually go to the nest box we put up. If you try it, make sure that you install it to where you can move it after a couple of years if they don't move in. Just keep trying different locations. The manufacturer's instructions will come with some suggestions on what direction to face them. You can play with painting them different colors, but bat boxes again are something that you need to maintain. Talked about Rachel's lawn with my ryegrass lawn is almost completely taken over by clover, which is not native, but it is a flowering resource there. And then the other thing that we can do is really keep our pets, especially cats, inside. The bell on the cat, this cat birds be safe color, which I'd actually never seen until someone shared this slide with me. But look at the statistics. Cats kill at least 1.3 billion birds a year, billion with a B. That is a lot. And I purposely don't feed birds in my neighborhood because I have neighbors that their cats are fully outside cats. And I just don't want to attract them in to be eaten by the neighborhood cats. But it is tough. As a pet owner, I have cats that are very angry with me, but they do go out on supervised visits outside, but I don't let them roam around. And with that, we have a test. No, I'm just kidding. I love this Gary Larson cartoon. I'm very sad that the Far Side went away, but here's the wildlife management finals. How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? So there's your final. And the link at the bottom was actually put in by someone who gave this talk last year, which takes you to some amazing resources in Clark County that will help you pick places to get out and view nature. So with that wraps up our presentation, but I'm happy to continue to take questions, and we'll engage Wyatt here, and we'll toss you some and see how you do, Wyatt. So is there any other questions, Grace, that you want to take?